Okay, cool. It's 5 past, so I guess I'm gonna start. Right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Addy. I'm a second year English student at St. Hugh's, and I'm currently the secretary of HUMSoc. And yeah, today I'm going to talk about just the effects of Indian philosophy on like two Western thinkers in particular. I was thinking of expanding it, but frankly, there's just so much to talk about that I've just confined it to Arthur Schopenhauer, who's this German philosopher, and then T.S. Eliot, who's a very well-known modernist poet, one of the most influential poets of the 20th century. I just want to preface this also by saying that in no way, shape, or form would I claim to like be an authority, but it's a personal interest of mine. So I've like kind of compiled like the kind of basic information that will help you maybe understand what they're trying to say and what they're engaging with. Um, and then kind of the insights that we can get from that. And then it's my intention like for us to have a discussion at the end as well, open up the floor. I mean, if at any point you find anything I'm saying confusing or you want to challenge it or ask a question, then please do in the chat or like use the waving hand thing. Um, or if I'm just being boring as well and talking too long, you can just tell me that in the chat as well. Um, but yeah, I'm just gonna yeah, so I'll just want to cover a few things that I'm hoping we can get from this like presentation. So I kind of just want to convey to all of you like the like pluralistic nature of like Indian philosophy and like by extension Hinduism as well. So I'm going to make that distinction in a minute. But like when we talk about things like um, Hinduism in particular, like it's a very encompassing term and it like incorporates a lot of different competing philosophical schools. So I kind of want to apply pressure to that and make sure that you know exactly what I'm talking about. So like in the following slide, I'll show you this breakdown. And then, yeah, I just want to show you guys how like a lot of prominent Western figures were really influenced by and also actually went on to influence the course of Indian philosophy in some ways. And then I also just wanted in a personal way to express how like as a Hindu, like the kind of beliefs I have come from like a variety of different philosophical schools. And it's not the case that you know you have to be like bound by dogma. You know, you can kind of incorporate or cherry pick, quite frankly, beliefs from these varying schools, and that's exactly what these Western figures do. So yeah, Shonal, could you go to the next slide? Cool. Yeah, so the first thing I want to discuss is what I mean by like Indian philosophy. So I kind of want to subdivide it. So the most conventional way of subdividing like Indian philosophy is into Astika and Nastika schools. So astika etymologically meaning there exists, and nastika being the negative of that, so it doesn't exist. Um, so really, the distinction between the two rests on a few things. So one of them is that astika schools accept the authority of the Vedas. The Vedas being this massive body of Sanskrit literature, which is like the foundational text for Hindus. So all the astika schools kind of fall under the umbrella of Hinduism by extension, whereas Nastika schools are actually like in many respects like fully fledged faiths in their own right now. So like Buddhism is a Nastika school, Jainism is a Nastika school. I mean, I list them all here. Um, some of them like Ajivika, Ajnana, and Charvaka, they're like much more dated and kind of just gone out of fashion because I think they were kind of swallowed up by Jainism and Buddhism, or they won like the philosophical like battle of ideas. Um, and then yeah, the Astika schools include Samkhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Visheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. And I'm going to discuss that in the next slide. So that's kind of the key distinction I want to make when talking about Indian philosophy. Um, Basically, some of them accept the authorities of the Vedas and some of them don't. Many concepts, they like transcend the two schools. So like ideas of dharma, which means like duty or righteousness. There's no single word translation, but that's maybe the closest thing. Karma, you know, like cause and effect, samsara, the cycle of life and death. Those are things that all of the schools are in agreement about, but like their ideas about the nature of the world, how you live a good life, those kind like materialism or non-materialism, those things like differ quite significantly. Um, so yeah, that's kind of a lot, I guess. And the reason I bring that up is just to kind of clarify that when we talk about Hinduism, I always find it interesting. It's such a cliche to say Hinduism or Buddhism, they aren't religions, they're ways of life. But like when you think about the characteristics of other religions, you know, they have like a clearly prescribed body of text. You know, for Jews, it's the first 5 books of the Old Testament. For Christians, the New and Old Testament. Like Hinduism doesn't really have that. It doesn't have a clearly prescribed canon. It doesn't have a conversion ceremony. I mean, I know Hinduism has become more political recently, and that's like a thing in India now, which people are talking about. But like scripturally there is no such thing as like a conversion ceremony. And then also Hinduism doesn't really have any prescribed founders or prophets. There are compilers who are then revered for having written things down, but no like prophets as such in the way that Abrahamic faiths have them. So I think the kind of thing I wanted to maybe gather from that, which I've put at the bottom of the slide in bold, is that Hinduism is really like a collation of all these Indian philosophies. I mean, Hinduism is spawned from these things and from these debates, and not necessarily the other way around. Like it has these pluralistic, kind of democratic origins, you know, like forged around oral debate. Um, yeah, and as a consequence, you know, yeah, it has many different influences. So yeah, the next slide, Shonal. Um, yeah, so these are the six Astika schools I was talking about, and I'm not going to go through every single thing because I'm not sure I know as much myself. But I just want, yeah, I think this infographic is just quite helpful in capturing like the varying and competing subdivisions that exist within Hinduism. So like speaking personally, like when I grew up as a Hindu, I never knew about any of these distinctions. I just, you know, I prayed occasionally, met a Swami from time to time, did my pujas, and like the mission that I was associated with, the Chinmay mission, falls under this category of Vedanta, the one at the very bottom. And that's a very popular and I'd say the most prominent kind of school of philosophy these days. And just to complicate things a bit more, even like within Vedanta, there's also like a fissure. So there's Advaita Vedanta, Advaita, and then Dvaita Vedanta, which is just that but without the A. And they kind of, and the difference there is basically dualism and non-dualism. So Advaita Vedanta, which is the school that I was kind of reared into, is non-dualistic, so they don't see any difference between the body and the soul. Whereas Dvaita Vedanta, for example, is dualistic and thinks that there is a difference between the body and the soul. Many of these schools, like Vaisheshika and Mimamsa, again, are like dated and they aren't really as prominent these days. And then yoga is an interesting one, right? Because obviously yoga has had cultural engagement with the West, right? Like when we think of yoga, we think of the physical exercise, right? That has been imported into the West. But what hasn't been imported are like the epistemological and metaphysical things about yoga, you know, that kind of underpin that. Like yoga is the school of like philosophy, and then the physical exercises that we now see in yoga are like the product of that. So I think it's interesting. Um, yeah, it's just I just saw that there was a comment. I'll engage with that afterwards. Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to say yeah that yeah something like yoga already has this cultural engagement with the West, but it's already partial and incomplete, which I think is kind of interesting. Can we go on to yeah the next slide? Um, so I'm going to get into the Vedas again. I'll go through this a little quickly, and I've highlighted the kind of key thing, the Upanishads, because that's when the Western influence kind of comes in. Because these Schopenhauer and Eliot, these two Western figures, they engage with the Upanishads. But I'm just going to quickly explain what the Vedas are at large. So there are four. The Vedas is subdivided into four. The Rig Veda, which is like devotional hymns. The Yajur Veda, which is prose mantras for worship and rituals. So if any of you have ever been to a puja, the kind of stuff that you'd hear being recited would probably come from the Yajur Veda. So it has an enduring influence in the lives of over 1 billion Hindus to this day, obviously. The Sama Veda, which is largely the Rig Veda, but is like set to a musical score, and it's a bit more precise in those ways. And then the Atharva Veda, which includes rituals for everyday life. Yeah, so they overlap, they have differences in emphasis and content, but it's subdivided into those four. And then within those four Vedas, those are also subdivided into four in the same way. So mantras and invocations, which are samhitas, aryanarkas, which are texts to do with ritual practices and ceremonies, brahmanas, which are commentaries on these ritual practices, and then Upanishads. Now, this is the kind of the key thing, and this is sort of the clincher that ties these Western thinkers into like Indian philosophy. These are like observations to do with like meditation, philosophy, and like spiritual knowledge. So like a lot of the pithy statements that you hear from like when you talk about Hinduism, one of them would be like Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which basically means the world is one family. Like all these kind of catchy quotable statements kind of come from the Upanishads. So that's the segment of the Vedas that has had like the most popular engagement. It's kind of the most readable, and it's the most self-contained. You can just read like one Upanishad and like get a lot from it. And yeah, the reason the Vedas are so important are because Hindus regard it as a parashaya, meaning not of a man, superhuman, and also that it's shruti, which means what is heard. The idea being that it's like received wisdom, like it's authorless, like it's just like a universal truth. And that, so while the Vedas is shruti, what is heard, um, other important texts from the Hindu canon are smriti, which means what is remembered. This last bullet point. So like these, like the Gita, the Mahabharata, within the Ramayana, these are written by authors, and in a way they're like distilled um distilled versions of the Vedas. Like the Vedas is like this foundational thing, and then these other things are sort of derivations that are inspired by that. Yeah, which I hope has made sense. Please let me know if I'm saying a lot very quickly, because I feel like I am. We can go to the next slide. Shonal. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I want to talk about the Arthur Schopenhauer, who's like this well-known German philosopher who was deeply influenced by the Vedas, and in particular the Upanishads. So here I have this quote that, you know, the Upanishads are the production of the highest human wisdom, the most profitable and elevating reading which is possible in the world. It has been the solace of my life and will be the solace of my death. And if you know anything about Schopenhauer, like he's quite a pessimistic guy. Like he's like pretty glum and depressing, frankly. So I don't know, I think the fact that he got so much joy out of this is sort of telling. Um, so his seminal work is this book called The World as Will and Representation. Um, like, and there's a lot to be said about that. I don't know how much I could even say with confidence about it. But within that, he's heavily inspired by the Upanishads, and in particular, this Upanishad called the Chandogya Upanishad, which you can find in the Samaveda. Um, and yeah, one of his arguments, which I quote, is individuation is only apparent. Even the multiplicity and diversity of individuals are only mere appearances, that is, existent only in the mind. My true inner nature exists in every being with the same immediacy as when it reveals itself only to me in my self-consciousness. And then he follows that up with this quote, Tattvam Asi, Tattvam Asi, which means that we are that essence. So like what that means, like it's quite hard to translate directly, but it's basically saying that we, like, the Hindu context is that it means we are the same as Brahman. Like there's no distinction between me and the supreme reality. Um, and the way that he uses it is to suggest that there is no sense of self. Like we are like there's nothing to distinguish any of us from one another, I want to say. And this Indologist Paul Hacker, I read his essay, and he said that in Hinduism prior to the advent of European influence, Tattvamasi was certainly not applied in an ethical sense. In any case, not in the sense of Schopenhauer's conception of ethics. So Shonal, if you go to the next slide, I think what I'll say becomes a little clearer. Which is basically that in the like, I'm just giving a short summary of his attitude towards will, like desire, in this book. Schopenhauer basically says that we will have this will to life, these set of desires, and we're basically slaves to these desires. Like 20 years later, in like a following text, he basically has this iconic quote. I don't know if you guys have watched this Netflix show called Dark. It's a really good sci-fi drama, and it's quoted in that as well, actually. And he says, a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he will. The point being that we act on our desires, but we don't control the desires that we do have. So it's sort of this deterministic outlook on life, which you can treat as maybe kind of sad. I think it feels quite sad. Um, and his sort of remedy to this kind of being a slave to your desire is like the kind of asceticism you see in Eastern philosophies. So like detaching yourself from the world, and consequently having fewer attachments, and then you'll suffer far less. This sounds a lot like Buddhism, right? And he says that when we reach this will-less state, we'll experience a kind of nothingness. And he footnotes this Buddhist concept called prajna paramita, which means the perfection of transcendent wisdom. Basically, the point at which you realize that, like, you have no will, and then you become sort of, I know it sounds very abstract, but like one with everything, where the subject and object no longer exist. Um, I guess what I was trying to say from like invoking Schopenhauer is I find it interesting that he has these hybrid influences from Indian philosophy. So he's happy to quote Tattvamasi from the Vedas, right? It's Vedic wisdom. But then he appropriates Buddhist concepts as well. So like Schopenhauer agrees with Buddhists in saying that, you know, there is no soul, there is no self. But then if you read the Vedas and the Astika schools of Hindu philosophy, all of them believe that we do have a soul. Um, so I think it's kind of interesting that he reveres the Vedas a lot, and then he still has these really pivotal disagreements. I think it's quite a powerful and beautiful thing, to be honest, because when you look at the disputes within these Indian philosophies, they operate in the same way. They like grew from one another. They shared concepts, borrowed concepts, and it's interesting seeing Schopenhauer, who's celebrated a lot for this work, by the way, like philosophers like Nietzsche, for example, were really influenced by this. I think it's interesting that Schopenhauer engages with that and kind of fashions it to his own ends, if that makes any sense. Um, yeah, cool. Next slide. Shonal, can you get the next if possible? Cool. Yeah, now I'm also going to talk about T.S. Eliot, which I hope it's also a little complicated, but I hope a little lighter and less dense. Um, so T.S. Eliot, for those of you who don't know, oh, can you go back? Um, can you go back a slide, Shonal, to the introductory one?
Yeah, it's the T.S. Eliot one, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm the Wasteland, 1922. I don't know if.
Wait, did you want this slide or this slide?
The one with the photo of him, if that's fine.
This one, yeah?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, as an English student, maybe I inflate him in my imagination, but for those of you who like don't know T.S. Eliot, he's like a very well-known 20th century poet. You've changed the slide again. I just need to still be on that slide. Yeah. He's a very prominent 20th century poet. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature. The literary movement, modernism, like owes a lot to him, basically. And just a little bit of biography about him. He did his undergraduate degree in like history and English at Harvard, and then he spent another 3 years studying Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. And then after that, he was meant to study in Germany. But because of World War I, he ended up at Oxford, where he had this banging quote, frankly, which was, I hate university towns and university people who are the same everywhere, with pregnant wives, sprawling children, many books, and hideous pictures on walls. Oxford is very pretty, but I don't like to be dead. I don't know if it's because he went to Merton or maybe he was feeling eighth week blues. But I thought it was just funny that he had that opinion of Oxford, where we all are. But yeah, the next slide, Phil. Chanel, can I get the next slide?
Yeah, sorry, I put it on. I don't know if your internet's being a bit slow. People can see this.
It might be me actually then. Let me see if I can pull up the slide I'm talking about on my end. Can you see
Adi, I think your internet's playing up a bit.
Okay. Is my net better now, or?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you a bit better now. Yeah, can you start that again on the Wasteland?
Yeah, cool. Sorry, I haven't even Hegel plugged in. That's really strange. Yeah, so T.S. Eliot's iconic work was his 1922 poem, The Wasteland, which is only 430 lines long, but like, yeah, his most iconic text, like his most celebrated sort of magnum opus, basically. Sort of like loads of references. So he mentions like Ovid, Shakespeare, Homer, all these really well-known writers. Like just yeah, scholars and academics talk about it all the time, basically. Generally, like the tone of the poem is quite bleak. So like he wrote the poem 4 years after World War One. And the narrative voice is like, has this sense of decay, and it's just generally the landscape. I mean, the Wasteland kind of captures the setting of the poem is like basically, just to give you a sense of how the poem opens. Can you guys hear me well, by the way? I can see myself moving slowly.
Yeah, I think we can just about hear you, but it's being a bit slow.
I don't know what to do about that, sorry. But it opens with the statement, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, which sort of really sets the tone. Like the narrative voice is just like lamenting the world. He thinks it's going into crisis. He asks, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. So yeah, it's generally quite bleak. Next slide, Shonal. Yeah, I can't see the next slide, but I think that must just be me. Let me check. Okay, cool. I can see it now. Yeah. So within this poem, like it does borrow a lot from philosophy. So he uses the popular Sanskrit number shanti shanti shanti, meaning peace, 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 at the very end of the poem. And then in the penultimate line, these three Sanskrit words, they are the Dhammayat, which come from this Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, even I think that's gone. And that can be found in the Veda. And those three words mean charity, compassion, and self-restraint. So I've said that this poem is quite bleak, but then it ends with charity, compassion, self-restraint, and then peace, 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 which is quite an uplifting way to end an otherwise bleak poem. And really what I think Eliot is doing there is he's powerfully evoking Indian philosophy as like a source of consolation in what is otherwise a bleak and barren poem. So like when he wrote to Bertrand Russell, this prominent philosopher and contemporary of his, he talked about this final section being the best, not only the best part, but the part that justifies the whole of the poem. And instead of talking about it, I thought we would maybe listen to the last bit of the poem, where this is all mentioned. Yeah, so Shonal, if you could pull up the audio. It's read out by Alec Guinness, by the way, if any of you know who he is. He's an actor. He played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original. Fun bit of trivia. So he read out this poem. So I think we'll like the final bit of that out loud to you guys, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it well. And then we can discuss how that's text. Also, we can discuss it after.
Rain. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. A jungle crouched in silence. Then the thunder spoke. Da. Datta, what have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and this only, we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent spider, or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Dayadvam, I've heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key. Each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Poi s'ascosi nel fuoco che gli affina, quando fiam ute che li don. Oh, swallow, swallow. Le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why, then I'll fit you. Hieronymo's mad again. Data, diadvam, damnata. Shanti, shanti, shanti.
Cool. I think everything lagging for me. So if I take a second to reply, just bear with me. Okay, like I can see the text. So it's quite confusing. Really Eliot, like a lot of things. I mean, he switches into I want to say Italian, the last stanza.
Adi, your internet's breaking up.
The,
You can't. Do you want to try maybe turning the video?
Okay, yeah, just give me a second. Let me try to switch Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Can you hear me well now?
Yeah, that seems okay.
Okay, fingers crossed it holds. Yeah, so so here on this slide, I've included basically what you guys had. So as I said, the second last line has data, deyadvam, and damyata. But then earlier on in that section, those words appear again. So data meaning given starts with data, what have we given? Deyadvam, which means compassion is there next. And then damyata, which means self-control, also comes up there at the start of the column on the right-hand side. So yeah, I just want to give you guys maybe a minute or two to read it. You might not like it all. It might not make much sense, which is fine. But I think just read 2 minutes in our own time, and then we can. If any of you guys have any observations that are interesting, please say them, or maybe just type them out in the chat. If you'd prefer that, that would be cool, I think. Yeah, so I'll just give you guys 2 minutes to read through it. Okay, cool. I'll open with an observation of my own. I know it's a weird poem, to be honest. If you guys have any observations of your own, again, I encourage you to just put them in the chat so we can maybe just chat about them. But like if you look at the first stanza, "Doth what we given," I think this line stuck out for me quite a bit in particular. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries. Which I think the point being that, like, when you die and all you have is an obituary, like all of the moments in your life that are interesting or daring or like profound might not necessarily just be captured. Like, how will we be remembered when we go away? I think is kind of one of the things that is being evoked from that stanza. And I think it's sort of like a kind of carpe diem, seize the day sort of spirit, which is like, if you read the whole poem, he's quite, the narrative voice is quite abundantly pressing at the start. And then this flourish near the end is sort of a reversal of that. So if you look at Dhamyata, which in Sanskrit means self-control, it says, "The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. You calm, your heart would have responded gaily when arrived, beating obedient to controlling hands." And I guess the metaphor there is like quite a common one, like your life being this boat and you being the person controlling the boat. And here in the stanza, the hand expert would sail and oar, the sea was calm. It's sort of a steadying of the ship in what is otherwise, you know, like a very turbulent poem. Yeah, I appreciate the giving you the last part of quite a complicated poem. It's probably like hard for people to come up with things on the spot, but I would encourage you to read the whole poem at your own time with footnotes. It doesn't take long. It's only 400 lines, and it's quite interesting. Thank you, Ami, for coming. And yeah, Shonal, next slide. Yeah, yeah, this is just some interesting stuff that I found while researching the talk. So one of them is a summary of the article I mentioned by the German neurologist. He would do a better job of explaining exactly how Schopenhauer interacts with Hindu philosophy. I didn't completely get my head around it. These are all hyperlinked, by the way, so we'll send the slides in the Facebook event afterwards. The second one was just another piece of reading to do with that. And then the last one, so I mean, if you guys, like, because I mean, I study English and I was pretty confused as well by like how Eliot uses like the Upanishads and Indian wisdom. I found that quite confusing. It was an interesting conversation I found on an online forum where some people made some really cool and impressive points about how he uses the Upanishads. In particular, Datha Deyadvam, Dhamyata. Yeah, so those are some interesting links. And then I think that is it. I hope you guys found that vaguely interesting. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thanks, Adi. That was super cool, really interesting. I was wondering, so you mentioned Schopenhauer and T.S. Eliot. I was wondering what else you kind of came across in Western philosophers who'd been influenced by Indian scholars.
Yeah. So I think one name I can give you off the top of my head for sure is Nietzsche, because he was influenced heavily by Schopenhauer. And then he sort of broke off, and he doesn't directly give Indian philosophy credit, but he has this idea of like eternal recurrence, or that things happen the same time again and again, which is, I feel, kind of similar to, you know, ideas of samsara, although I don't know how fair or true that is. I think the more salient comparison is that, like, and again, I don't know if Kant was influenced directly by Indian thought, but like some of the things that Kant talks about like the world, like phenomenology, or like, you know, the world being a construction of us, like the world doesn't exist independent of us, like that reflected a lot in Indian philosophy with the idea of like Maya and like illusion, the idea that the material world around us is just a construction of our mind. I think Kant and Indian philosophy are kind of seem very similar in that respect, but I don't know. Again, this is speculative. I don't have enough knowledge to definitively say that, but I think they are pretty similar in that way. I'll also just, thanks for that, Dylan. So Christian's asked some questions. You have Aristotle there. Where do you see the connection? Unlike Christian, I typed Indian philosophy on Wikipedia, and that was the first photo that cropped up. So I mean, there are some other names. Nietzsche, for sure, I know was influenced. Aristotle, I don't know precisely how he was influenced, but I'm sure there are. The earlier question, Christian, which was about would you get into trouble if you said absence of prophets and canon are a difference from the Abrahamic faiths? I mean, the canon for sure that definitely is a key difference, I think, because I think what I was trying to convey at the start of this talk was that when we talk of Hinduism, it's a byproduct of this philosophical engagement with Vedas, and then stuff spawned from it thereafter. But like, besides the Vedas, like there's not really any canonical text, and it's not like the Vedas said, you all become Hindus or anything. The question of prophets, I guess that's a semantic one. What do you mean by a prophet? I mean, you could argue that, for example, there's a
it's not so much about that. I mean, I've got a couple of friends in India, and I'm noticing. I mean, I'm not saying it's Trumpism, but basically, they're now in the kind of whole Modi India national phase or whatever you call it, and I just don't know whether it's something that is contentious or not, or whether you create if you even raise the topic, whether you create a volcano blowing up or whether it's like general canon.
Okay, no. So I mean, I think it's important that you raise the contemporary status of Hinduism, particularly in India, because I feel quite strongly about it, and it's undoubtedly political. I mean, religion is obviously political. I mean, to answer your question, yeah, it is contentious, I guess. What I could refer you to reading around it. Again, I can't say so much myself, but like if you Google Hindutva, Hindu and then TVA, that is kind of the word that is thrown around when people talk about contemporary politics and how the BJP as a governing party uses Hinduism in a political way. I'd stand by what I said personally, but that's obviously just my opinion. And I'd always be interested to debate around it. But if you wanted to know more about what is and is contentious, then look into like what Hindutva is, I guess. That's all I can really say. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
No worries. The theoretical existence of prophets is different from the actual practice of it. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think there's a difference between revered figures and prophets, because I guess, yeah, what do I want to say? I guess I could be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud now. But like, I guess my idea is that prophets have received wisdom from God directly. That's not really, other than like the person who would have written down the Vedas, which is expressly like just word like what is remembered, what is heard, sorry. There isn't really any kind of equivalent. So yeah, obviously, like you say, Hinduism has revered figures, but no prophets. I mean, deities, sure, but yeah.
I had one more question, if that's cool, Eddie.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting. I suppose with the three philosophers you kind of gave, so T.S. Eliot, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, they all came to quite nihilistic worldviews in the end, and it's quite interesting how they're in their own interest of Hindu philosophy. Do you think there's some kind of comparison to make there, or some kind of link we can draw out between the kind of the thought of these three philosophers and their interest in Hindu thinking?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think, yeah, I definitely think it's fair to say that Schopenhauer doesn't seem very like life affirming in his philosophy, because it does center around, the elimination of will. Yeah, I guess it just shows that the engagement is not the same as total agreement. I mean, as I said earlier, like Schopenhauer kind of co-opted aspects of the Vedas, but he didn't maybe agree with it in its entirety. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, to be honest. I need to think much more about this myself, frankly. Let's see if there's anything else. Wait, Mihir, if you're still around, could you elaborate on what you meant by your comment about profits? Because it's just, I'm thinking about it more, and I'm confusing myself a bit.
I mean, basically what, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like basically like it's true that no one like within Hinduism is given this idea of being God's representative on earth. But like the people who've like written the Vedas, for example, like figures in history, have always been like respected as people who have the right interpretation of Hinduism, and then they're respected as deities. For example, Hinduism co-opted Buddha as one of like these people who just had the right interpretation of Hinduism and then spread it across. So like they're not prophets in the same sense, but they serve the same role.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. So I mean Vyasa, Vyasa, he's credited as a compiler of the Vedas, and there's a festival, Guru Purnima, I think, is based around celebrating him. So I guess then it's a semantic question. Is he a prophet in all but name? Maybe. Yeah. I guess what I mean to say is it's not like, I guess within Abrahamic faiths, the prophets themselves are embedded within the work as prophets. So that designation is from the text, maybe. Perhaps that's a point of distinction. But you're right that there are a lot of celebrated figures, and then the distinction could be quite arbitrary. It's an interesting question. I'm going to think about that more, actually. Thanks. Cool.
Hey, Addy, I've just got one kind of general question. Wait, can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yeah, I can hear you, man.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, when you were speaking earlier that there's like Hinduism's kind of evolving, as in it's mixing a lot more with, Indian politics. I was just wondering, do you think that's a good or a bad thing, or and how do you think it's going to evolve in the future?
Well, yeah, again, I'm speaking only in a personal capacity.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm also like a little tired, so I really don't want to get embroiled in any kind of argument. But speaking personally, yeah, I find it very worrying. The kind of intersection between, I mean, this is me talking more about India now, maybe, but like India being at least founded on secular pretenses and it kind of deviating from that is something I find very upsetting, because I think what I personally gain from Hinduism is this sense of its pluralism, like its diverse schools of thought. And by extension, I think that necessitates a certain degree of tolerance that we're not seeing if people start saying Hinduism is the right way, or that Hinduism and India are synonymous. Because I find it worrying. That's me speaking in a personal capacity. I know a lot of people would disagree.
Do you think that's something that's quite recent? Like, is it or when do you think that's really started to become like an issue in your opinion?
What religion and politics, or?
Yeah, as in you mentioned, the like there not being that tolerance that there was before, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's very common. I mean, there's been religious violence in India like throughout history. There have been, what, 2002, 1984, there are loads of, so it's not necessarily, you know, like some kind of recent phenomenon, but I suppose the state now, I would say, feels more emboldened in turning a blind eye and even sanctioning at times. Not sanction, yeah, sanctioning is a contested term, but like turning a blind eye to violence. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to speak further without, I don't know how informed I am, to be honest, but that is my impression, basically. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, Mihir hasn't, he's posted an interesting comment in the chat which says Hindutva was born in 1920s, played a big role in partition and saw its resurgence in 1992. But many would say Hindutva is inevitable when Hinduism exists. Yeah, I mean, that question, that raises a lot of interesting current, questions. Because I mean, I guess people like, I mean, there's an idea called like, as in two-nation theory, like, or like the idea that Hindus and Muslims and the subcontinent can't coexist. And so a partition was necessary. And people like believed in Hindutva, like Veer Savarkar, I'll talk about his name. He's an interesting figure in Indian history. No, I didn't message that to everyone. But if people are interested in political Hinduism in a modern setting, the name I'm typing is, he was, a lot of people would hold him up as an inspiration. Him, and then people like Jinnah, who's the first prime minister of Pakistan, recognized that like interfaith tension was like severe and sort of fundamental. And so that meant that there had to be two different countries. Again, that's like very complex question. I don't know too much. But yeah, interesting to contemplate and learn about, definitely. Yeah, if there's anything that I spoke about too quickly or seemed confusing, you can ask about that as well. But yeah, it was just really just an assortment of stuff I kind of found vaguely interesting, and I slapped it into one presentation. So it didn't seem that cohesive, but yeah. Thanks, Christian. I'm glad you found it interesting. Cool. I'll give you guys maybe a minute or two. I'll hold out on maybe there being another question or so. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Eddie. Okay, I've gotten one question from Disha. Thank you, Disha. Have you found in your research that mistranslations in Sanskrit have given false impressions about Hinduism? This is a great question. I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know something similar being the case. So like, I don't know if you guys have heard of this poet called Rumi. He's an Iranian poet. In sometime in the first millennium AD, so I want to say like 600 or 700 AD, something like that, give or take 100 years. And he's very popular in the West, like kind of, he's almost become a bit of an Insta poet. Like a lot of girls like quoting Rumi because it's like very aesthetic and that kind of thing. But I'd read in a recent article actually on translations of Rumi, basically by people in the West, and they removed all of the religious and devotional aspects of his poetry. So like Rumi was religious, and he was kind of mysterious as well, and they removed like a lot of the religious subtext, within the poem through translating it. And so the stuff that Western people read and kind of quote is like a very misleading impression of Rumi. It probably resembles the translator's stuff more than Rumi himself. So your question is very interesting, Disha, because I would probably think maybe people in the West would have done the same. Like if in the 19th century some Westerner translated Sanskrit works, and I mean, we know that Schopenhauer worked off a French translation, I want to say, of the Upanishads. I mean, how faithful that translation is, I'm sure there's an answer actually out there on the internet, but it's something worth questioning, yeah. Because that obviously has implications.
But it's even in Western culture, it's exactly the same. I mean, you see all the Aristotle quotes running around, and you just look at the way it is phrased, and you can be sure that Aristotle never said anything the moment you read something like Nicomachean Ethics, because it's really, really not pleasant to read. It's content, it's interesting, but it's just not quotable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, translation is quite important. Oh, Eddie's posted a very interesting comment. Sanskrit grammar was relatively accessible thanks to Panini, who's like this prominent Sanskrit grammarian, who inspired a lot of Western linguists. Yeah, so maybe, hopefully that would render up the translation compared to other languages if the grammar was widely known. Fingers crossed. Okay, cool. I think that kind of concludes the talk basically. Thanks so much for all coming. Before you guys head off though, if any of you are interested in applying to be on the Hindu Society Committee next year, we've actually posted out an application form on our Facebook page. So please give that a look and apply for any position that takes your fancy. Yeah, thanks so much again. I'm glad that some of you guys found that helpful or interesting in any way. I'm going to post the slides on the Facebook event itself. So if you want to have a look at the links I suggested at the end, then please go ahead. And if you have any questions at any point, or you just want to talk about any of this, then please actually message me on Facebook. Because I mean, in the process of like reading around this, I realized basically how little I knew as well, and how much more I still want to know. So, great. Thank you so much. Let me put my camera on. Let me just wave goodbye. But yeah, thank you. Hopefully I'll see some of you around in more normal times, in person. Cool. Bye.